The older he grew, the more he realized that some stories stay with you forever, like fingerprints pressed into the mind. The American commander, Colonel Mark Ellison, had served in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and Southeast Asia for more than 25 years. He had met soldiers from every kind of background, trained elites, hardened veterans, and young recruits molded by discipline. Yet when reporters asked him recently which group of soldiers he admired most, he didn't hesitate. The Filipino soldier, he said, because they never surrender. It was a bold statement, one that made people curious. But the colonel never gave interviews for attention. He spoke because of something that happened a decade earlier, something he had tried not to talk about publicly. But as more veterans retired in the years past, he felt the story needed to be told. Not for him, but for the men he had witnessed in the darkest hours, men who fought even when they had nothing left. The story began in a dusty forward operating base in the Middle East, where American and Filipino troops were assigned to joint humanitarian and security operations. Tensions in the region were rising that year, and intelligence warned of militias planning attacks near villages receiving international aid. Their missions sounded simple on paper: help evacuate civilians and guard the medical teams. On the ground, nothing was simple. Colonel Ellison had worked with foreign units before, but the Filipino battalion assigned to him surprised him from the start. They arrived carrying heavy gear but greeted everyone with warm smiles, joking even under the heat. Their commanding officer, a calm but sharp-eyed man named Captain Rivera, shook Ellison's hand and said, "Sir, don't worry. Where you go, we go." Ellison laughed, thinking it was a polite introduction. Later, he understood it was a promise. The operation began smoothly. They escorted families out of a threatened zone, safeguarded the supply trucks, and secured positions around the medical center. For 2 days, everything seemed manageable. Then, on the third day, a local informant warned them of an ambush planned along the evacuation route, a narrow passage, between rocky hills where armed groups often hid. Ellison gathered his officers, including Rivera, to decide whether to reroute or push through. "The villagers can't wait," Ellison said. "They'll be trapped if we delay." Rivera agreed. "We go," he said. "We'll take front and rear security." But the part Ellison remembered most was when Rivera added, "Sir, whatever happens, you get the civilians out." Well, hold. It wasn't a dramatic statement. He said it like a man who had already accepted every possible outcome. Ellison didn't know then how prophetic those words would be. The convoy moved out before sunrise. Everything felt too quiet. The morning air carried a strange stillness that made even the Jeep engines sound louder than usual. Ellison remembered glancing at Rivera, who was scanning the hills with unwavering focus. The Filipino captain's calm was unnerving, like he expected something. At the midpoint of the route, the first explosion hit. The earth shook. Sand and smoke filled the air. A truck at the front of the convoy jolted sideways. Before anyone could react, gunfire erupted from both ridges. The convoy was pinned down. "Ambush!" someone screamed. But Ellison barely heard it over the chaos. His training kicked in. He shouted commands, took cover, returned fire. The American soldiers moved quickly. But what struck him was how the Filipino troops reacted. They didn't scramble or panic. They spread out with precision, firing while guiding civilians behind barriers. 2 of them shielded a group of elderly villagers with their own bodies, taking hits to keep others safe. One Filipino soldier, a young sergeant named Dela Cruz, sprinted through open ground carrying a wounded Afghan boy in his arms while bullets cracked around him. Ellison yelled for him to stay down, but the sergeant ignored it. When they finally got behind cover, the soldier collapsed, breathless but smiling faintly. "It's okay, sir," he whispered. "Kid's safe." Then he passed out. Ellison never forgot that moment, not the bravery, but the humility. Like saving a child under fire was simply part of his day. The firefight intensified. Militias were pouring in from both sides, clearly prepared for a long assault. The Filipino soldiers held the rear and flanks, pushing back waves despite being outnumbered. Their discipline amazed Ellison, but what hit him harder was their attitude. Even under fire, they joked with each other. One shouted, "Hoy, aim properly." "My hair's precious." Another yelled back, "Your hair left you 2 years ago, bro." The strange mix of humor and bravery baffled the American troops, but it kept spirits alive. Even in the worst moments, the Filipinos never looked defeated. After 30 minutes of intense fighting, Ellison radioed headquarters. Reinforcements were on the way, but the commander knew they wouldn't arrive in time. Ammunition was running low. The civilians were terrified. The convoy couldn't move without exposing itself to gunfire. "We need to break the line," Ellison said. Captain Rivera nodded. "My men can do it. Give us 5 minutes." The plan was insane. Rivera's unit would push up the left hill, drawing fire and creating a distraction while the convoy rushed forward. Ellison wanted to refuse, but Rivera placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Rivera didn't wait for permission. He signaled his men, and they moved. But the Filipino soldiers advanced with fearless determination. They shouted at each other, cheered when someone hit a target, and kept moving forward even when wounded. One private, barely older than 19, took a hit near the shoulder but refused evacuation. He wrapped a bandage around himself and kept firing. Another soldier saw Ellison watching and shouted, "Sir, we're okay. We just need more bullets." Ellison felt something tighten in his chest. He had seen bravery before, but not like this. Not cheerful bravery, not hopeful bravery. The kind that says, "If I fall, my brother continues." The kind rooted deep in culture and family and every story Filipinos grew up with about sacrifice and resilience. When the Filipino unit reached the ridge, the fighting became brutal. Rivera was hit once in the leg but stayed upright. De La Cruz, already injured earlier, fought beside his captain with fierce resolve. They pushed the attackers back inch by inch until finally the militia broke formation and retreated into the hills. The path was clear. Ellison ordered the convoy to move and the vehicles surged forward. As they passed the Filipino soldiers on the ridge, the American commander saw something he would never forget. Rivera and his men, battered, dusty, bleeding, but standing tall laughing, even. Soldiers who had nearly died protecting strangers, still finding strength to smile. When reinforcements arrived an hour later, the battle was over. Filipino unit had secured the area. Rivera was finally sitting down, exhausted. Ellison approached him. "Captain, your men, what they did." Rivera lifted a hand. "Sir, please. We don't want medals. We just want water and pancit." They laughed despite the wounds and the chaos around them. It felt unreal. But later, the real weight of what happened settled in. 3 Filipino soldiers were seriously injured. 2 had almost died, yet not a single civilian was lost. Not one. In the medical tent, as Ellison checked on the wounded, one Filipino soldier looked at him and tried to sit up. "Sir, did we complete the mission?" Ellison nodded. "You did." The soldier smiled weakly. "Good, because Filipinos don't surrender, sir." "My father always said that." Ellison had to step outside afterward. He felt something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, overwhelming respect that came from witnessing courage at its purest form. Weeks after the incident, during the debriefing, the American general called Rivera's unit exceptional, but Ellison felt that word didn't capture it. Exceptional was skill. Exceptional was training. What he saw in the hills that day was something else, something beyond military textbook definitions. He saw heart. When the Filipino troops eventually rotated back home, Ellison stood at the airstrip as they boarded the plane. Rivera approached him one last time. "Thank you, sir, for trusting us," the Filipino captain said. Ellison shook his head. "No, Captain. Thank you for saving us," Rivera smiled. "We didn't save you, sir. We saved the mission." Big difference. That statement lingered in Ellison's memory for years. Because in that moment he understood something powerful about Filipino soldiers. They didn't fight for glory or recognition. They fought for purpose, for people, for each other. They fought with a resilience born from generations who had endured everything colonization. Natural disasters, wars, hardships, and still stood up with a smile. Filipinos grew up hearing stories of grandfathers fighting with bolo knives, parents surviving typhoons, communities rebuilding from nothing. They learn early that life may push them down, but they push back harder. That spirit doesn't vanish on the battlefield. It becomes their armor. Everywhere Filipino soldiers serve peacekeeping missions, international coalitions, disaster response missions, they carry that same spirit. A courage mixed with humility, a toughness mixed with humor, a willingness to fight even when all odds say stop. Years after the ambush, when Ellison was asked why he admired them so deeply, his answer came easily. Because when everything goes wrong, he said, when there's no ammunition left, when backup is too far, when the mission seems impossible, the Filipino soldier will look at you and say, "Sir, we can still do this," and they will. They never surrender, ever. His voice always soft at that last part, because he knew it was true, and because the world needed to hear it. At military conferences, he often told new officers, if you want to understand the Filipino fighting spirit, look back at every war they've survived, even when outnumbered. Look at every rescue mission they've led, even when unprepared. Look at every hardship their families endure back home while they serve abroad. Then he would pause and add, and look at how they still smile. It wasn't just physical bravery that impressed him. It was the emotional strength, the ability to comfort others while bleeding, to laugh in fear, to hope in despair, to never let darkness swallow their spirit. In modern missions, Filipino soldiers continue to gain respect around the world. Their contributions during UN peacekeeping operations, their discipline during joint exercises, their compassion during humanitarian crises, all of it reflects a deeper truth about who they are. Colonel Ellison once summarized it perfectly. They're not the loudest. They're not the biggest. They're not the most equipped. But they will stand their ground longer than anyone expects. Not because they have to, but because they believe no one gets left behind. And that, he concluded, is why I will always admire them. Through the years, the colonel stayed in touch with Captain Rivera and several others. Some retired, some continued serving, some trained new recruits in the Philippines. And every time they messaged him, their tone remained the same cheerful, friendly, humble. "Hello, sir. How are you? Do you need backup? We can bring Pancit." They always joked. They always kept things light. Even when life wasn't, Ellison, now older and wiser, often tells younger soldiers that courage isn't just running into danger. Courage is finding strength after everything has failed. Courage is offering a smile during the worst day. Courage is holding the line because the people behind you have no one else. That day in the desert, under fire, with villagers crying and bullets tearing through the sand, Ellison saw courage embodied not in machines or weapons, but in the men who stood battered, bleeding, but unbroken. Filipinos, never surrendering. And that is why, when people ask the American commander whom he respects most on the battlefield, he always answers with a proud, unwavering smile. The Filipino soldier,